Good morning. Welcome back for our seventh lesson in our study of the divided kingdom. So we are studying the period of time after the glory days of Israel with Saul, David, Solomon, and during the time that Israel was divided into northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Judah. And last week we were really focused, actually the past 2 weeks, we've been very focused in the northern kingdom. We had the whole story of the extended story of who's been our focus?
Ahab.
Yeah, the king Ahab. So we had seen a little pattern that it was, God would raise up a king, and then as they sinned, he would, and their son took over, there would be a coup, and God would raise up another king, and as they sinned and their son took over, there would be a coup, and then we might expect that to have happened to Ahab, but instead, we got a long story. Ahab had a long reign, not a short reign, but he had what kind of a reign? Go ahead, Dia.
Well, he didn't do God's will.
Did not. Yeah, that's
very involved with Baal.
Right, very involved with Baal. So he really converted Israel over to Baal worship. And what a problem, right? And so instead of immediately shutting down Ahab's reign and taking him out, what kind of a time, what kind of events do we have during Ahab's reign?
Well, he was killing prophets, and so a lot of them were being hidden.
Yes. And what about on God's side too? Oh, I lost you for just a minute. Yeah, I think you're back. Say that again.
Well, I was just say what was the question? Yeah,
God what does God do? What do we see on God's side, the activity going on during the reign of Ahab?
Well, Elijah and 400 Baal prophets went up to Mount Carmel, and Elijah baited the prophets and said, oh, yell louder, do all these things. Maybe he's asleep, maybe he just can't hear you. And then when he prayed to God, he even had him pour water on the altar 3 times, and God used fire, and then they killed all the Baal prophets.
Okay, so we have this story of God bringing fire from heaven. We're going to get an echo of that in today's lesson. Our fire falls from heaven in response to the word of the prophet. And so we really see that as one of the peak moments in God's prophetic address to Israel. Right? So this is a time of intense prophetic activity. Elijah, but there were other prophets too, right? We see some were hiding in caves. We see various, even prophets come and say to Ahab and say, I'm going to give you a victory, right? So we had all of this activity where God is aiming to pursue his people. Right? He addresses the Baal worship of the Israelites before he addresses the kingship and the dynasty in the house of Omri and Ahab, right? So God keeps bringing out prophetic activity, keeps having Elijah prophesy. We met Micaiah. We've had some prophets that we just, a prophet came and said. So all of this prophetic activity is all aimed at pulling Israel back from that Baal worship, right? There were a lot of opportunities for Israel to follow God, and we saw that some did, but Ahab, he had his ups and downs, but he was a weak ruler, wasn't he? He was very susceptible to suggestion. Anything anyone told him to, if you read all of Ahab's story, anytime someone tells him to do something, he just does it, right? So he has a time of semi-repentance, and God keeps giving him opportunities, and we're not used to looking at it that way, but there was a lot of grace in the story of Ahab, wasn't there? We saw that with the battles that he was able to win in the middle of, this time. Like we think of Ahab as all bad, and yet God used him and said, I'm going to have you win a battle. I don't want the nations to think that I'm only a God of the hills and not a God of the plains, right? God is making an effort to testify for his name, through Elijah, through all of these prophets. Comments on any of that, on the lessons up to this point? Okay, well, so we've been Northern Kingdom, right? We even had a king in of Judah referred to that we hadn't officially met yet during the reign of Ahab, because it was so focused on the Northern Kingdom. And now it's trying to check in with the Southern Kingdom of Israel, right? When we left Southern Kingdom of Judah. When we left off, Asa was the good king with a long reign after some bad kings, and we saw Asa did okay, but he struggled. He had his ups and downs, right? But the Southern Kingdom has been much more stable, and that may be why we have fewer stories about it. Okay, so after Asa, let's meet his successor. Someone read for us. I think is it Sandy? Yes, it's Sandy. Read for us 1 Kings 22, 41 through 50.
Oh, okay. Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, became king of Judah in the fourth year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah, daughter of Shilhi. In everything he walked in the ways of his father Asa, and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel. As for the other events of Jehoshaphat's reign, the things he achieved and his military exploits, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? He rid the land of the rest of the male shrine prostitutes who remained there even after the reign of his father Asa. There was then no king in Edom, a deputy ruled. Now Jehoshaphat built a fleet of trading ships to go to Ophir for gold, but they never set sail. They were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. At that time, Ahaziah, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, "Let my men sail with your men." But Jehoshaphat refused. Then Jehoshaphat rested with his fathers and was buried with them in the city of David, his father. And Jehoram, his son, succeeded him.
Thank you. Okay, so we're back to the Southern Kingdom. Asa, we saw, it said, got rid of the shrine prostitutes, but then we get some notes here. So we get several little points. What do we learn about Jehoshaphat?
He follows in his father's footsteps, and he doesn't remove the worship places, the high places of worship.
Okay, so his overall assessment, he gets the thumbs up, right? He gets the good king mark, following in his father's steps, who also got the good king mark. But he does not remove the high places. What does that mean to us?
Well, there were high places that were worship where the Canaanites worshiped Baal, but there were also high places where the Lord was worshipped.
Right, and you've hit on the exact problem with the high places, is that muddiness. Okay, so God had said, when the people were supposed to come into the land, he said, get rid of the high places, because that is all tied to Canaanite worship. Well, when we see the high places in use in Judah, Israel, the whole kingdom of Israel, what we see is that the people are influenced to a smaller or greater degree by the worship of the Canaanites, right? They were supposed to go to the temple where they would hear the word of the law read at every, the festivals, or like read the word of the law at this point. This is how they would be educated in the religion, the worship of Yahweh, which was so different from the surrounding places. And if they never went to the temple, it would be very difficult for them to really follow the word of the Lord, because this is how the leadership of the country was able to teach what the worship of the Lord meant. It was so different, right, from these surrounding nations. So when they try to worship the Lord on the high places, what we see is very often we get idols added to those high places, or we get the worship of the Lord somehow diluted or corrupted or lost. We get the thread of who Yahweh is and why he's so different from what they expect is lost as they worship on the high places. And so our text will continue to mention this over and over. They didn't remove the high places, and you can always tell it was a bad thing, right? It's always like, well, he did good, but he didn't remove the high places, right? Well, the high places are everywhere, right? This is the grassroots thing, right? Not easy for a king to go and handle, and yet we see that through it, the worship of Yahweh is corrupted, is diluted. Does that make sense? Questions or comments on that?
But it still says that he did right in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah, he was, I mean, I think we get that, he tried real hard, right? Nod here, right? So removing the high places would be a level of reform in Israel that would be very hard to achieve, right? Because this is just the habits of the people to go and like find a hill and worship there, right? And so we see this over and over again. Good kings very often are marked as good, and yet there's this little note that sadly they did not remove the high places. Yeah.
And he did have peace with with the king of Israel. Yeah.
Right, very good. Okay, so this is another thing we learn about Jehoshaphat. We saw that in the reign of Asa, he was a good king, but he had some problems, right? And so we saw that one of his problems is the war, this sort of civil war. People of God are fighting against each other. And so one of the good, now that we've had 2 generations of good kings in a row, we're having, we saw there were generational effects of sin, and we're going to continue to see that in Jehoshaphat's reign. But one of the good outcomes is that he has made peace with the kingdom of Israel. Yeah.
But at the end of this, down in I think it's 49, the king Ahaziah asked to have his men sail with Jehoshaphat, and he turned him down. So, even though they're not enemies, he probably had some reservations about him.
Okay, so these ships, great point. What is going on with these ships? Why are we even talking about these ships?
Something about gold.
Okay, this is an echo, right? We are getting an echo from Solomon's reign. If we go back and compare a couple of verses that talked about the splendor and the strength of Solomon's reign, I'm going to give you 2 right now. 1 Kings 9, 26 through 28 is one of them. King Solomon also built a fleet of ships in Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. Okay, you're seeing a tie. We just heard about Edom, right? And now we learn that Ezion-Geber is in Edom, right? And continuing with Solomon. And Hiram sent his servants. All these names are hard to keep track of, right? Hiram was the king that he made the treaty with. In Solomon's case, it was the power play from Tyre and Sidon. He was much more powerful than Hiram, and Hiram was supplying him with cedars for the the building of the temple and the palace. And then Hiram had all these stone workers. He had all this skilled labor, remember? And Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who knew the sea. The Israelites were not sailors. They did not know the sea. They were not good at sailing, right? So Hiram, remember, with the skilled labor, is also providing skilled in terms of these sailors, right? Hiram sent his servants with the fleet, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. We get another note on this story in 1 Kings 10:22. For the king, still talking about Solomon, had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So we're getting the sense of the opulence of Solomon's reign, and how part of that opulence is coming through this fleet of ships that he built, and he used his power in the area, his diplomatic power, his military power, to pull in skilled sailors. And then the gold is coming from outside the kingdom and flowing into Israel. So this wealth, opulence, all of these exotic animals we see. So that was what was going on in Solomon's reign. Okay, compare that to Jehoshaphat's reign. How does Jehoshaphat's version compare? What does he try to do?
It seems that he tries to return to the Lord, but there's not much information here.
Yeah, and I think he doesn't get the significance that Solomon gets, certainly. But then, like you're seeing, like as he's returning to the Lord, he's also trying to imitate who?
Is it Solomon?
Yeah, there's a sense of like, oh, we're doing better. Let's try and be like Solomon was. Let's try to recapture some of those glory days. So he has this. He calls it ships of Tarshish, same as in 1 Kings 10:22, where we saw the same fleet called the ships of Tarshish. So he made ships. He's going to go to Ophir for gold. He's trying to imitate the reign and the power and the wealth and the sort of the breadth of influence that Solomon has. But how does it turn out?
He doesn't have sailors.
Apparently they don't know what they're doing. They don't even get to go, right? The ships are wrecked before they even sail, right? They did not go, for they were broken at Ezion-Geber. And Solomon had, foreigners. He was able to take them on his ships. His power was at a level that Jehoshaphat's never is, right? He can't even let his ally, the king of Israel, send people, because I think he just doesn't know what he's doing on these ships, right? So we have this sort of echo of the reign of Solomon, but it doesn't reach the level of the reign of Solomon, right? We get another, that little tie to Edom is in there. What does it say about Edom?
No king there.
Okay, so how did they get a deputy?
Right, okay. We have to read between the lines here. There's no king in Edom because there's a deputy over Edom. That means Jehoshaphat's deputy is ruling Edom. Okay, so what we're getting is we're seeing that Edom is under the control of Judah. Judah is ruling over the land of Edom during this period. And that's why he has access to build the ships at Ezion-Geber in the land of Edom. We have to put these passages together. When we talk about Solomon's reign, it talks about deputies ruling over Edom. So these are all echoes of Solomon's reign, and yet none of them kind of come up to the level that Jehoshaphat would have liked to have. Yeah.
So Jehoshaphat appoints these deputies? Is this?
Yeah, this would be like an official. So another translation is an official over Edom, meaning that he's got, Edom is his vassal, right? He's got power over Edom. He's got a deputy ruling in Edom. That's why there's no king in Edom. Right? They didn't exactly spell that out for us, right? We had to like put it together with how Solomon reigned and say like, oh, why are they mentioning that there's no king in Edom? How does that relate to us? Well, it relates to us because Jehoshaphat is the king. He's ruling through his deputy. Thoughts? Questions? So we've returned to the southern kingdom, and we're getting a story that is very similar to Asa's story in a way of like, yes, they were good kings and that they were trying to follow the Lord, but there were still problems, generational effects of sin, right? There were problems in the land. The people were not entirely following the ways of the Lord, and that had its effect in the high places. We saw that even though the text was generous to Asa and say he got rid of the shrine prostitutes, well, now we see, well, except the ones that he didn't get rid of, which Jehoshaphat's still working on, right? So there is still, we see this over and over in scripture where like we go like along thinking that everyone's faithful to God, and then suddenly they start talking about somebody's idol at their house shrine. Or we mentioned that there were the rest of the shrine prostitutes, or we mentioned something about an Asherah pole at a high place, or, and so we know that even though, it's not one simple story. The people, the kings are trying to return to God, and yet we see there are still so many of the problems of idolatry and the effects of sin and idolatry in the land are still real, and they're still following through. And so, lest we think that our times are complicated and their times were simple, there is this ongoing struggle for what it means to follow God and what it means to follow God as a group where not everyone understands who God is. So we really see how that plays out in their struggles.
It's hard to put in mind that these are going on at the same time. These two kingdoms, when we're separating them like this, it's hard to think, okay, they're both happening.
Israel and Judah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, and as the text jumps back and forth, it's a little hard to keep the timeline in our minds. But we have a note here that Jehoshaphat became king in the 4th year of Ahab, and Ahab had a long reign. And so what we see is they're mostly parallel. Right? Most of Ahab's reign in northern kingdom is Jehoshaphat. And then we see that he's still reigning when the son Ahaziah begins to reign as well. So try to kind of keep that timeline in your mind. This is all, Jehoshaphat's reign is pretty much parallel to Ahab, and then follow on a little overlap with Ahab's sons. Dia.
Well, I have a question. It says male prostitutes. Previously in other lessons, we've talked about prostitutes at the temple, and a male prostitute. Does that mean that women would go to the temple and find a male prostitute, or are these male prostitutes for the men? I mean, I'm very confused.
This kind of so this is I think it was in lesson 4, we went back to Leviticus and we read about all of the practices of the people of Canaan, right? And how all of those practices, and so many of them were what we would consider abusive sexual practices, where there is someone in a position of power having sex with someone who is in somehow vulnerable to them, right? We saw that as we read through that Leviticus chapter. And what we're getting, and it's that sort of and we go like, wow, this is a lot of bad stuff. I wonder why he has to tell them not to do all those things. And then we see at the end of that chapter, it says, because these are the practices of the nations around you. And we saw that that was why God had judged the Canaanite nation so harshly, is that this is part of these abusive sexual practices were part of not only their culture, but their worship. right? And so that this is very pervasive in the land. And so when we see this, it may just refer to prostitutes. Remember when Ahab dies and the blood runs down into the chariot, and they go and they wash it out in this pool where the prostitutes bathed? This is probably, part of prostitutes, probably part of the idolatrous practices, right? It's pointing out that Ahab's end was right alongside the sins that he participated in and encouraged in the land of Israel, right? And so what we're seeing here is like those behaviors where there are male shrine prostitutes. We're probably talking about male prostitutes for men to visit. That all of this would be part of these idolatrous worship practices.
Okay, well, I guess I'm just naive.
The Bible doesn't shy away from these things either, right? Like it lists it all out and says these sins, like don't have sex with your granddaughter or your grandson. And you're going like, oh gosh, no, the Bible doesn't shy away from it, right? It's there's a sense where it says like, look, this is what's happening. It is damaging to people, it's damaging to a whole culture. I think that's what it was talking about when it said that it defiled the land so that the land vomited them out. So we get a real sense of the corrosive and destructive effects of sin here. Okay, anything else on this section? Good discussion. So we've met Jehoshaphat finally. What we know about him is more evident in some ways in the stories of Ahab, right? Where he's the one that says, well, isn't there a prophet of the Lord we can inquire of? So we see that he really is trying to follow God. He has his problems, as do all cultures, but the sin in the nation, it does affect him and this time. And so after this brief step into the southern kingdom, we go back to the northern kingdom. Will you please read for us? I want to give you a little heads up here. We are going to read continuously through the end of First Kings and into the beginning of Second Kings, because this is one book in the Hebrew Bible. It's the Book of Kings, and it's broken up for scroll length. And so, these are really sort of a connected passage. So 1 Kings 22:51 through 2 Kings 1:8, please.
Ahaziah, son of Ahab, became king of Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, because he walked in the ways of his father and mother, and in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. He served and worshipped Baal and provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger, just as his father had done. After Ahab's death, Moab rebelled against Israel. Now Ahaziah had fallen through the lattice of his upper room in Samaria and injured himself. So he sent messengers saying to them, go and consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, to see if I will recover from this injury. But the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, go up and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and ask them, is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going off to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore, this is what the Lord says, you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. So Elijah went. When the messengers returned to the king, he asked them, why have you come back? A man came to meet us, they replied, and he said to us, go back to the king who sent you and tell him, this is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are sending men to consult Baal-zebub, god of Ekron? Therefore, you will not leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. The king asked them, what kind of man was it who came to meet you and told you this? They replied, He was a man with a garment of hair and with a leather belt around his waist. The king said, that was Elijah, the Tishbite.
Okay. Oh, I know that guy. Okay. Yeah. So, note, so the way this is structured, right, it was similar to Jehoshaphat. We get this quite often where there's a little summary of the beginning where you get the length of the reign, and then you get some content, some stories about the reign. So what is the length of the reign of Ahaziah? You have to go back to 1 Kings 22. And so the fingers
2
held
years.
up 2 years. So why is 2 years a familiar date that we would think of for the reign of the sun? This is echoing our pattern, right? Right. So remember, we had Jeroboam, long reign, prophecy against him, son reigns 2 years, house is wiped out, there's in a coup, and there's another king. Baasha, long reign, prophesy against him, son reigns 2 years, household is wiped out in a coup, and there's a new king. Omri, long reign, but then Ahab, long reign, and now Ahaziah, we learn, reigns 2 years. So we may be expecting, and there was a prophecy against the house of Ahab that said the whole house of Ahab would be wiped out, right? It had all those echoes of the same prophecies against the house of Jeroboam, against the house of Baasha. So we're thinking like, okay, is it coming? Is it about to happen, right? That 2 years is a kind of our trigger into this pattern where we see God is the Lord of history, where he raises up kings and brings them down, right? When they don't, when they disobey and lead his people astray. So that length of time. What happens to Ahaziah? What's going on with him?
He falls through the lattice in his upper room. And
Yeah, but
apparently
this word is kind of obscure. He may have fallen through a window. He may have fallen, we're not sure exactly, but he's obviously severely injured, right? Because he's asking, what does he want to know?
Am I going to die? Am I going to live?
Am I going to live? Am I going to die? What is it going to be? And when we hear the echoes of, Elijah's prophecy, like the God who lives, the widow says we're going to die. He says you're going to live. These sort of echoes, like life and death is in the hands of the Lord. And we see that Ahaziah, who should he inquire of?
God.
Yeah, Yahweh, the God of Israel. But what does he do instead? So this should come as a jarring, a discordant note, right? He sends to inquire of a prophet of
Baal.
Baal.
Right. Yeah, Baal. And it's interesting. He uses. Sandy? Did your translation say Baal Zebub or Baal Zebul?
Baal's B-U-B, Bub.
Okay.
Beelzebub.
All right. You may have Baal Zebub, or you may have Baal Zebul. They are Beelzebub. Beelzebul means Lord exalted or exalted Baal. Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies, and it's either a variation on Beelzebul or a corruption used by Israelites in reference to Beelzebul, as like a
Slang.
Yeah, it's like a derogatory, like a diminishing kind of title, right? It may be that that's a play on words making fun of Baal. We see the same thing in the book of Mark when they accuse Jesus of being in league with who? Anyone remember that story in the book of Mark?
With the devil.
Yeah, they say he's in league with the prince of demons, and they talk about Beelzebub or Beelzebul, and different manuscripts have each, right? So we have this sense of like this power from this Old Testament story is being kind of referenced in the New Testament story in a way that associates it with Satan, associates it with evil, associates it with the prince of demons, right? So this god was probably a permutation of Baal that is particularly in use in the city of Ekron. Ekron was one of the Philistine cities. One of those, they had like a conglomeration of city-states that were the Philistine nation. And so he basically sends him to Ekron to find out from a prophet of Baal. What does God do at the same time?
Puts Elijah there.
Yeah, God sends his angel to send Elijah. Okay, and how does that go with Elijah? What do you notice from that section with Elijah?
He asked a question. He says, why do you think there's no God? That you have to go to Baal? That there's no God in Israel?
Right. So once again, we get a real sense of God's motivation throughout this whole story, right? So much of what is happening over the course of this history of Israel is God saying, let me show you that I'm here. Let me show you that my name is the name of power. Let me show you that I'm in a position of power, and I'm not subject to the weaknesses of the gods of these nations, right? So this is God working for the glory of his name, right? He sends Elijah, and Elijah says, is it because there's no God in Israel that you went to Baalsbub? And the oracle is what? What's going to happen?
He's
going to
let
die.
him die.
He's going to die.
Yeah, he's going to die. And so the messenger, the messenger would have had quite a journey, right? He would have been expected to take some time, because the Philistine area, Ekron, is all the way like as far south as Judah, and then as Jerusalem, and then over on the coast of the Mediterranean is where we get the Philistines, right? So he should have had a significant journey, and instead he's met in a very abbreviated version of his journey and comes back. And so the king is going like, why are you back already? And the man tells his story. What is the king's question to him?
What kind of man was it who came to you?
Yeah, and how is the man described?
Garment of hair and a leather belt.
Yeah. So this is the classic description of what a prophet is like, right? He's out in the wilderness. He met him in the wilderness. He has this garment of hair. He has the leather belt. These are the same descriptions that we hear of John the Baptist in Mark 1. And we get that the John the Baptist story is pulling on this story, right? This is what it looks like to be a prophet of the Lord. These are some markers of someone who is a prophet of the Lord. And the king immediately recognizes the description and is like, oh, that guy, I hate that guy. So he recognizes that this is Elijah, this prophet of the Lord. Okay, so what is, when we get to verse 9, he sent to Elijah a captain and a company of men. What is the king's response? What's the overall, what's he trying to do when he sends soldiers after Elijah?
Bring him back.
Yeah, get him, right? That's the response. That guy has prophesied against me, get him. Okay. Haven't we seen that before? Right? Jeroboam, as soon as the prophet prophesied against the altar, he's like, come back. He's trying to get him, right? Come back to my household with me. No, I'm not supposed to eat bread or drink water, right? when the drought, when Elijah proclaims the drought in the land, Ahab is searching for him everywhere. So get Elijah. Everybody is on the lookout for Elijah. He's sending to foreign kings. Have you seen him? And he's making them swear that they haven't seen him because he's trying to get Elijah, right? When Micaiah comes and says, no, you're not going to be successful at Ramoth Gilead. You will indeed die. He says, get him, lock him up till I come back safely. Of course, Ahab never does come back safely, right? We wonder what happened. Did Micaiah get released since he was obviously telling the truth, or did he die in prison there? We don't know. So the response is get him. So read for us 9 through 18, please.
Then he went to Elijah, a captain with his company of 50, this is the man, a company of 50 men. The captain went up to Elijah, who was sitting on the top of a hill, and said to him, man of God, the king says, come down. Elijah answered the captain, if I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. Then fire fell from heaven and consumed the captain and his men. At this, the king sent to Elijah another captain with his 50 men. The captain said to him, man of God, this is what the king says, come down at once. If I am a man of God, Elijah replied, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. Then the fire of God fell from heaven and consumed him and his 50 men. So the king sent a third captain with his 50 men. This third captain went up and fell on his knees before Elijah. Man of God, he begged, please have respect for my life and the lives of these 50 men, your servants. See, fire has fallen from heaven and consumed the first two captains and all their men. But now have respect for my life. The angel of the Lord said to Elijah, go down with him. Do not be afraid of him. So Elijah got up and went down with him to the king. He told the king, this is what the Lord says. Is it because there is no God in Israel for you to consult that you have sent messengers to consult Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Because you have done this, you will never leave the bed you are lying on. You will certainly die. So he died, according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken. Because Ahaziah had no son, Joram succeeded him as king in the 2nd year of Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. As for all the other events of Ahaziah's reign and what he did, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel?
Thank you. Okay, so what is Ahaziah trying to do? Why does he want to get him? Why? What's the point?
Well, maybe he wants to talk him out of the prophecy.
I think you're onto something, right? Remember the sense, the idolatrous view of gods is, it's all about a power play, right? You can do the right rituals, you can sacrifice the right things, and then you can make the god do what you want. If you know the name of the god, that gives you power over the god. There's this interchange and power play that is presumed when you're talking about the idols in the nations, right? If you can make a prophet recant a statement, then you can use that to control the god who is giving power to that statement. So there's sort of an underlying misunderstanding of the nature of God here, right? Get him and I can somehow make it, I can force my way into making this work for me to get a better result, right? And so what happens?
Well, he loses 100 men to begin with,
Right.
and his two captains.
Yeah. And what were you going to say?
Just lost my train of thought.
Oh,
I had a thought. I did. I'll get back to it.
no problem. How does he lose these captains? What happens?
God sends the fire from heaven
Okay.
twice.
Which echoes what?
The fire that was on the Mount of Carmel with Elijah.
Right. So this is a direct sort of example of God versus Baal, right? Yahweh versus Baal. And
I was just going to, it occurred to me a minute ago, maybe he really didn't want the truth. And that's why he went to Beelzebub, Zebub or whatever his name is, instead of going to Elijah. Maybe he really didn't want to know what was going to happen to him. That was just
Especially not if he didn't have control over it. We always are tempted by the idea of a God that we can control. And we know that a God that we control is no God at all. And yet the idea that we can manipulate, I mean, it continues to kind of show up in our current and our, our modern day thinking and in our hearts, right? Our human thinking tends towards, how can I'd rather seek a God that I can control so I can get what I want out of these situations, right? Right. So and you notice the wording of the captain. The first is the king says, "Come down," and the second captain, the king says, "Come down at once." Right. These are commands. Right. They're issuing commands, and in his effort to issue commands to the man of God, we see that the power of God is far superior, right, to any power of Baal or any power of the king, right? Not only do we have this comparison between the power of God and the power of Baal, but we have the comparison between the power of God and the power of the king. The king is lying in his bed, but God can send fire down from heaven and immediately consume these groups of 50 men, right? What happens with the third captain?
He kneels down and calls Elijah a man of God. He recognizes that he is who he is.
He's
Yeah.
control.
He comes as a supplicant, not as a demander.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a real sense of of humility and respect for the obvious power of God. You would think the second commander would have had some kind of respect for the power of God, since the first one's just got consumed by fire, right? Apparently it took more than that, or maybe it took a person with a different heart, a heart who was willing to humble himself before God and to say, "Please, I'm your servant." And so Elijah goes with him. But even when Ahaziah has direct access to Elijah, as he thought he could use to control the situation, can he use it to control the situation?
No.
It says, and so he died. So we get that repetition of that message, right? So many times we have heard the words, "Is it because there is no king in Israel that you're going to Baal?" Right? That has been a refrain that has been repeated through the story. And so we see its importance. It's really, this is the theme, right? There's a king in Israel, and there's a God in Israel, and it is Yahweh. And he is the true God, and he wants to show himself to be the true God. And so Ahaziah dies as a result of this injury. But what's going on? We like the 2 years, and then we were expecting like the who and the destruction of the house of Ahab. What happened?
He had no son, so Joram succeeded him as king.
Okay, so we see like the readers going like, "Oh, okay, this prophecy came true," but Elijah's previous prophecy, which was in 1 Kings 21, we get in the section 17 through 24, Elijah prophesied against the whole house of Israel. He said they would be visited by disaster, they would be consumed, they would be like the house of Jeroboam, they would be like the house of Baasha. We get a very explicit reference to that pattern, right? That hasn't happened yet, because Ahaziah just dies from this injury, and then the next king, and we see he has no son, so this guy Joram, and I want to note, some of your translations may call him Jehoram, and some may call him Joram. Those are variants on the same name, and what's confusing is that pretty soon there will be a king in Judah with that name who also is referred to by those two variants of the same name. And so some of your translations will try to minimize the confusion by calling this one Joram and calling the other one Jehoram. It would be like, let's just all call this one Billy and this one William, so that we can just keep everybody straight, right? Some of your translations do that, but these are the same name in Judah and Israel. Like we didn't have enough trouble keeping our king straight, right? We get that same name. But so I think the text seems to assume that we know who Joram's father is. Who is it? Does anyone? It doesn't say it here, but who is Joram's father? Anyone know?
Jehoshaphat?
Right,
Oh.
Ahab. Thanks, Pam.
Ahab.
We find out in 3:1 that these are brothers, right? One brother dies and the next brother succeeds him as king, and he is Ahab's son. And so it's still in the time of Ahab's son that we're waiting for the other shoe to drop on that full prophecy against the house of Ahab.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Who are we saying is the son of Ahab?
Ahaziah and Joram.
Joram. Okay.
So look in verse 17. Because Ahaziah had no son, Joram, who we later learn is also a son of Ahab and a brother to Ahaziah, succeeded him as king in the second year of Jehoram, same name, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah.
Okay.
So in Israel, we got Omri, Ahab, and then Ahaziah and Joram. So that, like, on the family tree, those are brothers, but first Ahaziah reigns, and then when he dies, he has no son, and his brother Joram reigns, also a son of Ahab. So we are expecting this prophetic outcome. We know it's going to happen, but the next several chapters are going to be very focused on who instead.
Elijah.
Yeah, Elijah goes into the succession of Elisha. And so next time we're going to really just talk about Elisha. We're just focus on Elisha. Chapters 2 through 8 have all of those stories. We see Elijah taken up to heaven, Elisha coming into his prophetic position, and all of the things that he does in his role as an inheritor of double the Spirit, right? He's doing double, right? Watch for that as you read these sections. And so it's a long section that we're going to go through next time. So be sure to, give yourself a little advance time to read chapters 2 through 8, because Elisha sort of repeats the element of Elijah's prophetic time, and in many cases doubles. There's a sense of doubling. Okay. So that we'll be back in Northern Kingdom again, right? I guess when people are bad, there's just more stories to tell. So we get the stories of Elisha coming through to follow that up. But meanwhile, we still have these thematic elements running through the whole story, right? There's a reason that when we get to the Gospels that they pull on these stories, right? This as John the Baptist is described as hairy and with a leather belt and out in the wilderness, we see that he is the culmination of the prophetic work of God through this whole time, through this time of history in Israel, so that God has been working so hard all this time to have a prophet that will draw people back to himself. Right? And when Jesus is accused of being in league with Beelzebub, we see that there has been this battle against evil and against the demonic powers and evil powers that want the heart of God's people, that want to consume Israel and pull them away from God. And it's God in sending his son. He says, this is the person who is the enemy of those evil powers, the enemy of Beelzebub, the enemy of Satan, right? And when Jesus answers their accusation that he's in league with Beelzebub, he says, if you want to rob the house of a strong man, you first have to go in and tie up the strong man so that you can take over the household. Well, the strong man that is ruling is Satan in Jesus's story in Mark 6, right? The strong man is Satan. And so Jesus, all through here, we see the influence of evil coming back over and over again, and its corruptive influence on God's people. And it's not until Jesus comes to tie up Satan, to bind Satan, it talks about, to take over. He's made his home in Israel, even though it was always supposed to be God's people. He has such a strong foothold so that it affects them time and time again. And it's not until we get the work of Jesus to really to have that victory over Satan that we will really see the fulfillment of what God is doing in the history of Israel. Questions or comments on that? Or on any of our lesson? Thank you all. It's been a good discussion. I really appreciate it. We'll stop our recorder so we can do our prayer time.
Yeah.